Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload 3 times a week on this channel, once on a Wednesday, which is a fashion and lifestyle video. Fridays are my weekly uni vlogs of my life here at university, and then Sundays are my Unsolved Sundays where I discuss some sort of unsolved disappearance, mystery case, anything along those lines. So today I'm back with an Unsolved Sunday video and I'm going to be discussing the case of the Keddie cabin murders. This is an absolutely baffling case. I was completely in the rabbit hole when I was researching this one, and there's quite a few theories that I've kind of come across, mostly on like Reddit threads and things, so there's a lot to discuss. So this might be a long video. So as always, you might want to grab like a cup of coffee or something and we shall just get started with the discussion of the Keddie cabin murders. So as always, I'll start off with a little bit of background information into who is involved in today's case. This case revolves around a woman named Glenna Sue Sharp and her 5 children. So in November 1980, Glenna Sue Sharp, who is actually referred to as Sue, all of her friends and close ones apparently called her Sue, so that's just what she's known as throughout this case. So Sue Sharp and her 5 children moved into a small cabin. It was called Cabin 28 and it was in a place called Keddie, California. The cabin itself wasn't huge, it wasn't extravagant, but it was big enough just for all 6 family members, and it was just off of a railroad in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The town of Keddie itself that they were living in was only small. It only had a population of around 100 people, and then there was a nearby area called Quincy which was much larger. It had a population that was closer to about 2,000 people, but still it was quite a small close-knit area. There wasn't loads of people, so it was like kind of your typical small town. So the 5 children in the Sharp family were John, who was 15, Sheila was 14, Tina was 12, Rick was 10 and Greg was 5 at the time of this incident. Sue made her living off of a monthly check. It was around $250 check that came through every month from the Navy because her husband was a war veteran. She also collected food stamps for her and her family, and then she also earned a little bit of extra cash because she was enrolled in a federal education program. So they weren't living the most lavish lifestyle, but everyone said, like throughout this case, all of her loved ones and people who knew them knew that Sue was a woman who always provided for her family. She did whatever she could to give her children everything that they wanted and needed. On April the 11th, 1981, Sue and her family had been living inside the cabin for just around 5 months. And inside the cabin on that day was Sue, and then the 2 youngest boys, Greg and Rick, and then there was also a friend of the 2 boys named Justin Smart. He'd come over. The boys had asked Sue if he could stay over for a sleepover that night earlier on in the day. And the Smart family were neighbours. They were neighbours in a nearby cabin in the same area. So Sue knew them, the family knew the Sharps, and Justin was just a close friend of them, so he was staying over. It wasn't really out of the ordinary. John, the eldest son, had made plans to go out through the whole day with a friend of his called Dana Wingate, who was 17, and the 2 of them were planning on, I think they were in Quincy for the day, and then they told Sue that they'd be back at some point in the night and they'd go straight down into the basement, which is where John's bedroom was, and they'd spend the night in the basement just kind of so she didn't have to worry about where they were. So in terms of the plans of these 2 boys, it is not clear as to whether they actually came home and interrupted the incident when it took place during the night, or whether they'd already made it home and they were just victimised just as part of the crime. So at around 8 AM on April the 12th, the next day, Sheila, the eldest daughter of the family, was at a sleepover at a nearby cabin. She was just at the neighbour's cabin, and she returned home. She walked in her living room and she noticed immediately there was a really pungent, strong, overpowering smell. As soon as she walked into the living room of her cabin, she saw the bodies of 3 people on the living room floor. Immediately she noticed John and Dana, who had both been bound by their ankles together. They were bound using medical tape and electrical wiring from different appliances around the house, and they'd basically been beaten to death. And then there was a 3rd body under a yellow blanket, but she didn't stop to look who it was. She just ran out of the cabin and ran to a neighbour's cabin crying for help. So as it turns out, under the yellow blanket was Sheila's mum, Sue Sharp. She had also been beaten to death, and she had also been bound with medical tape as well as an extension lead, and then she was placed under a yellow blanket. When the authorities arrived, they immediately checked the other rooms and they found the young boys asleep unharmed. They'd slept through the whole incident. And strangely, one of the first earliest red flags of this case is that it took the investigators hours while they were searching the house and things, to notice that Tina, the youngest daughter, the 12-year-old daughter of Sue Sharp, was missing. Some sources say that young Justin, who, the friend of the 2 young boys, had actually tried to tell the investigators straight away when he noticed that Tina was missing, but apparently they just brushed him off They were just focused on what they were doing, and basically it took them way too long to notice that a young girl had been basically abducted. On a closer examination of the 3 bodies, they found that Sue and John had both been beaten with a claw hammer and then stabbed multiple times, obviously that cause of death. And then Dana he'd actually been killed with a different hammer, but his cause of death was different to the other 2 victims. So he had actually been strangled manually to death. So someone had actually used their hands after beating him senseless to end his life, which I think is absolutely horrifying. It's also, from an investigator's standpoint, it's very strange, the completely different sort of ways of death, and I will talk about that in the theories as to why they were murdered in different ways. And obviously immediately, quite early on, they suspected that it was more than one person who carried out this crime. When the authorities actually searched the household, they found a knife. It was a steak knife, I think. It wasn't like expensive or anything, but they found it, and it actually appeared to have been used with such force that the blade itself on the knife had been bent to a 25-degree angle. So someone had obviously used it with some extreme force to be able to actually bend the blade. Obviously, considering where the bodies were found, there was quite a considerable amount of blood found on the living room floor, but they also found a small patch of blood on Tina's bed. So obviously they noticed she was missing. They found a very small patch of blood on her bed, which does lead investigators to believe that rape was perhaps the motive as to why they took her, rather than killing her like her other family members, or like leaving her alone like the young boys. So there was a little bit of difference in motive there, and there's a question as to why she was taken, but obviously that is kind of the initial theory. There's absolutely no evidence of what happened to Tina. They have no idea where she was taken at this point, or whether she was taken, whether she'd run away or anything. When I say there was nothing, there was absolutely nothing. The investigation turned up no new leads or no new information until around 1984, when a portion of a skull was found in a nearby area called Buck County in Feather Falls. So obviously, because they found a bone fragment, they decided to do a complete extensive search of the area, dig up everything they could in the surrounding area, and there was a number of things that were found, like little pieces of bone, stray bones here and there. Obviously, it's kind of hard to identify whether it was a certain person's. Most likely they were just a mixture of people's remains. These other discoveries didn't lead to any new breaks in the case or anything, and obviously at first they weren't going to assume it was Tina's skull, but the skull portion itself actually raised a lot of questions, and they didn't know whose it was initially. But not long after they found the portion of bone fragment from the skull, the Buck County Sheriff's Department actually received an anonymous phone call that said that they knew that the bone fragment belonged to Tina Sharp. Now, another very, very strange red flag in this case is that this phone call of the anonymous caller saying that they knew that the bone fragment belonged to Tina Sharp and they should look into that, it wasn't for some reason recorded in the official case files until around 2013, when the recording of the call was actually found in the bottom of an evidence box. So it wasn't in any official records or anything, it was just found on a loose recording in a box many years later. So that is very strange. It's a question of whether it was intentionally left out or whether it was just happened to be misplaced or something, but it's very strange that this was not in the official records. So obviously, like I said, very early on, investigators were adamant that there was more than one person involved in the attack, and they actually went on record saying that they believed obviously it was premeditated because the medical tape wasn't found in the house before the attack, and also they must have known the area or must have had some help in the area, because investigators were sure that with the amount of blood and the method they used to attack these victims, they would have been covered in blood leaving the scene, and someone would have likely have seen them unless they had help or knew the area. So a number of people were questioned, obviously, in terms of, especially in the area, they were looking for anyone who's seen anything or who might have had some sort of connection as to why they would have wanted the Sharps and Dana Wingate dead. And one of the first people they questioned were the Smart couple, who were Justin Smart, the young boy who was staying around for a sleepover, his parents, because they lived in a nearby cabin. Now, Justin's parents, their names were Marty and Marilyn Smart, and there's a little bit of, I say a little bit, there's quite a lot of weirdness surrounding their families, a little bit of drama. So, in short, Marty and Marilyn, they were separated or they were going through a divorce, something along those lines. I can't tell the specifics at the time, but they weren't happy. There was quite a lot of incidences in their relationship, and Marty went actually on record saying to the investigators that he wasn't happy with how involved Sue had become in offering Marilyn support, saying that Marty wasn't good for her and everything along those lines, because I think there was rumours that he was quite abusive towards her. And because of their like turmoil in their marriage, Marty had actually recently moved in with a friend of his named Bobadee, I think that's how you pronounce it. And Bo is actually, he's an ex-con friend of Marty's, and he has quite a long rap sheet, so he became a huge red flag in the suspect list. So they questioned him as well as to whether he could have possibly had some sort of involvement in the attack. So there wasn't any initial strong evidence to suggest necessarily that they were the two people involved in this attack, but it was also kind of like an unspoken thing that a lot of people thought they were, and they were very capable of it, especially since, like I said, the investigators believed they had to know the area. Obviously they lived just down the road, so they became huge suspects, but there wasn't a lot they could do about it. There was a letter that was just literally in recent years, when the case was reopened, it was unearthed, that Marty had written to Marilyn just after the murders, and I'm going to read it out to you. It's very strange. So it said, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've brought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we're through. Great, what else do you want?" So when they found this letter, Marilyn said that she never actually received this letter, but she was adamant that it was Marty's because she recognised his handwriting. Again, in more recent years, when the case was reopened, investigators tracked down a therapist in Nevada who actually, allegedly, Marty confessed everything about that night to him, saying that he was the one that attacked the Sharp family. And when the investigators went back and, questioned why the therapist didn't come forward, the therapist actually was shocked and said, "I told investigators this when it was initially going on, and I found it weird when you didn't use it to convict the 2 men involved." So that's all very strange that the therapist knew about it, told investigators allegedly, and they still did nothing with it. So again, very early on, it raises questions as to whether there is some sort of cover-up involved, as there's a lot of missing information and kind of things brushed under the rug. And to this day, neither of them are alive. Bo died shortly after in 1988, and then Marty died in 2006. So there are no answers as to whether they actually were the ones who committed the attacks. So there is a huge amount of speculation with this case in terms of a police or a potential police cover-up, because like I said, there are so many aspects of this that were forgotten or misplaced, or just kind of, I don't know, like sugar-coated in a way that it seems a little bit strange. Many people, like, one of the biggest flags that they still focus on and pinpoint in this case is just how long it took investigators to notice that Tina, the 12-year-old daughter, was missing. And then even during the initial investigation, when they realised she was missing from the household, the focus of their investigation didn't seem to change. They didn't seem to focus their search on finding Tina, they focused it more on the actual bodies. I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain, but they didn't seem to switch the investigation to the missing 12-year-old girl, which is very strange. So in 2013, the original sheriff's investigator, his name was Mike Gamberg, he was pulled out of retirement on account of the case reopening. They wanted to see if they can unearth any new information by looking over the case files again, quite those years later. And this is when they found Marty Smart's letter, as well as the recording of the anonymous phone call. It was at this point as well they managed to also find what they believed to be one of the murder weapons used in the attack. So a man came forward after hearing about the case reopening and said that he'd been using a metal detector nearby Cabin 28 in more recent years, and he actually discovered a hammer in the pond. It was a steel, blue-handled claw hammer, which matched the description of what the investigators believed killed Sue and John, as well as it turns out Marty had said that he was missing a hammer matching that description perfectly that night. So obviously I think he tried to sort of make it seem like someone had stolen it from him. But yeah, they found this at this point. This man had come forward and said he'd found this hammer, and they believe to this day that that was the claw hammer used to attack Sue and John that night. So like I said, this was when they discovered the recording of the anonymous phone call, and this was actually found in the bottom of an evidence box, like I said, but it was in an unopened file, or it looked unopened. So it kind of gave the impression that it was intentionally sealed and avoided and left in the bottom. So during the reopening of this case, Gamberg, the investigator, he said his focus was on this anonymous caller because at this current point he seemed to be the only person, or he or she seemed to be the only person who would know anything about what happened that night. I have a quote here from the sheriff of Quincy, the nearby area, who was also involved in the revival of the case. So he said, "There are people locally who know more than they've said, and I believe we've identified some of them, and we know who they are, and we know where they are. And I have every confidence that they either participated after the fact, or they have had first-hand information. It's obviously a worthwhile pursuit. There is not an expiration date on homicides, and to the extent that we have surviving siblings and family members, it is our fundamental obligation to them to understand who did this and why. So like I said, kind of the most popular suspects in this case are Marty and Bo Bobadee. But a lot of people do actually speculate as to whether they had help, and it was kind of like an unspoken thing with a lot of the locals, whether it was kind of a bigger organised incident. So I'm going to go on to the theories. There were a lot here, so I'm sorry if this is really long, but I'm going to go into some of the theories that I found dotted about and different people's opinions on what possibly could have happened. The first one was obviously kind of like the most obvious one that came about when investigators first discovered the scene and the suspects. So the first theory goes that Marty and Bo Bobadee had initially planned to kill Sue Sharp for her involvement, because Marty was unhappy with their involvement in his marriage, and they'd gone there perhaps under the influence of some sort of substance that kind of increased anger. And that would go along the lines of John and Dana being victims, more so because they interrupted the crime as opposed to setting out to kill them as well. The second theory goes that perhaps there was some sort of drug deal that had been planned between Bo Bobadee and Marty Smart with John and Dana, because John and Dana were 15 and 17, and Bo and Marty were kind of, you know, they weren't the cleanest of people, so there was some sort of theories perhaps that there was a drug deal that just ended badly. There was also another theory that perhaps it was a drug deal gone bad between John and Dana, but with someone else, not Bo and Marty, because obviously they were out all day, they were doing a lot, there was a lot of people that they would have encountered, so perhaps something had happened in that day and they'd been followed home, or there was a planned drug deal that went bad. There was a man actually who found a bloody sweatshirt nearby in a river or on a riverbank, but this person in particular was actually, I think the person that came forward about finding it was actually a known drug user, so there's a lot of questions as to who they may have come in contact with, and perhaps something had gone wrong there. The fourth theory goes that there was a man named Robert Joseph Saverio Jr., who was later actually coined the Boxcar Killer, and he was a serial killer active around the time. He was known for travelling along the railroads of this sort of area, killing other passengers on the freight trains, as well as like people nearby when they stopped and stuff. When he was discovered, he was obviously incarcerated, but some people speculate perhaps because of the location of cabin 28 that they fell victim to the Boxcar Killer. However, this doesn't necessarily fit with his typical like murders and crimes, because a lot of his other ones, obviously, like I said, there were passengers or nearby, so he in the past did not go to people's houses and murder some of the family. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of issues with that case, but that is a possibility. Theory number 5 goes that Sue or John, because they were older and they were neighbours to the Smarts, perhaps saw something and knew something that Marty Smart and Bo Bobadee didn't want them to tell anyone. Perhaps something, whether they were doing something illegal or they'd witnessed something and they just wanted to keep them quiet. So theory number 6 is something that I actually, the more I look into it, the more I find really, really interesting and perhaps more and more likely. So this theory goes that the main focus of the attacks was actually Dana, not the two Sharp family members. Evidence to support this is actually kind of focused on the method in which Dana was killed. So if we're going along the lines of Marty and Bo Bobadee being the perpetrators of this act, Dana was killed in a different way, not only a different way to John and Sue, but in a slightly more what seems personal way. He was manually strangled as opposed to the others who were stabbed, and that just seems a little bit more kind of like there was a lot more intention behind it. It was a bit more angry and they wanted to kill him themselves. So Dana, who was 17 at the time, he was known to date older women. And if you think back to when I was explaining about Marilyn and Marty's issue in relationships, it's actually said that Marilyn was known to go out with some boys around Dana, not far from Dana's age. So a lot of people speculate whether perhaps there was something going on between Dana and Marilyn that Marty wasn't happy about, or if nothing was going on, it's completely innocent, they were just, friends of neighbours, but Marty still saw him as a threat to his marriage with Marilyn. So this was perhaps a more of a personal motive as to why Dana was killed. Now the next theory revolves around Tina and why she may have been the focus of the attacks and why perhaps she was actually kidnapped. So it's likely that Tina was initially taken as a trophy as opposed to either being left like her younger siblings or murdered like her other siblings, and then she was later perhaps killed because she became too much of a risk to keep around because obviously everyone was looking for her. So one theory goes that perhaps Bo or Marty or both of them had previously to this night been sexually abusing Tina, and they'd perhaps scared her into secrecy until this point, until they could take her away, and that was sort of like a big secret. They were afraid of being exposed for what they were doing to Tina. Another possibility to this scenario is that perhaps Tina was being abused by someone else, and Sue found out, threatened to tell the authorities, and then, you know, was attacked, and then John and Dana were caught in the middle, perhaps because either they wanted to tell or they interrupted as the attack was occurring. This theory initially came about when there was news of a teacher. It was one of Tina's teachers at her school. He was later convicted of sexual offence against a child, so some people think there may have been some link there, and yeah, there's sort of a couple things to suggest that maybe Tina was the victim of a sexual assault. So yeah, there's a couple things there that point to Tina being the actual victim of this crime, kind of like being the target of it, and everyone else, unfortunately, who were murdered perhaps came in between whatever happened. So the next theory is in relation to the potential police cover-up and why some of the information was perhaps or seemingly purposely ignored from the case files and from the public eye. Some people speculate that perhaps Bo D, like I said, he was an ex-con. Some people think that perhaps he was actually an informant for the police because he had a lot of contacts, so they actually wanted him to keep safe. They didn't want to get him in trouble, because they wanted him to remain on the streets as an informant, so they chose to hide some piece of information as a means of protecting Bo. So theory number 9 is that it was actually quite a large-scale operation involving a number of law enforcement members and a number of local residents, because since Keddie is such a small town, like it's so small, it is really strange that absolutely no one has come forward with anything, considering it's so small that everyone is likely to know each other. No one's come forward with any suspects or anything along those lines, so a lot of people think that there may have been a larger operation at hand that was kind of to blame for this attack. And the final theory, again, it's just a theory, there are no immediate pieces of evidence to support this, but some people speculate that perhaps the Sharps weren't actually the targets, and unfortunately they were sent as a warning to someone else. So like I said, Keddie was such a small town, and it's likely, and some people think that perhaps maybe the Sharps were there was a third party involved and the Sharps knew them, or they were close to someone else, and the third party had done something wrong, and they were actually the ones who someone wanted to send a message to, and it was kind of like a threat to them, and unfortunately the Sharps fell victim to this, hence why not every member of the Sharp family were killed. So yeah, there are a number of potential theories out there. Like I said, there aren't always like initial really strong evidence to support each one, but they're all quite interesting, so let me know down below if there's a particular one that stood out to you, or if there are other ones that you think are quite, you know, prominent. Let me know down below, as well as any other cases you'd like me to discuss in further weeks' videos. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys soon for another video. Bye!